Coming up, maintaining morality in corporate America.
I'm all for moral courage, don't get me wrong, but I don't think that's our biggest need. I think our biggest need is moral competence.
Business ethics expert Mary Gentile discusses Greg Smith's resignation from Goldman Sachs and the client who fell through the cracks. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
I discovered Mary Gentile through a book galley that was sent to the Carnegie Council, and she really won me over when we had a vigorous discussion about the Carnegie Council's own business ethics workshops. She's very passionate in her approach to business ethics and really knows how to voice her values. After earning a PhD, Gentile cut her teeth in the business education business at a little place called Harvard Business School, writing cases there. She's currently affiliated with Babson College School of Business, which is regularly ranked #1 on business rankings of schools in entrepreneurship. And Giving Voice to Values has become much more than just a book. The curriculum is available for free online with many cases and resources for educators across the globe. And Gentile also consults with companies and business educators around the world, spreading her message that people don't need to be given values, they need the tools to implement those values. Greg Smith wrote a controversial editorial in the New York Times in March of 2012, and Goldman is known for being the most value-driven on Wall Street historically, but he decried a decline in the firm's moral fiber.
The two questions I wanted to get your thoughts were on, and you can think about them, I think in this sequence might be helpful, is first, what have you been hearing from people? And that may be from your peers if you work in the financial industry, or if you teach in the financial industry, or if you yourself have been talking to fellow investors. But then I also am interested in your own sort of reactions, and knowing who's in the room, I think it could be quite interesting.
I believe that the financial industry is very similar to many other industries in a certain way. And that is that incentives and compensation drives everything. Mm-hmm. And how you create that incentive structure can undermine any kind of value structure that you think you have. You know, even when businesses think they're acting in good faith, you've got that incentive structure that just undermines the entire thing.
In terms of people in the finance industry, one of my friends who's at Cap One says the lay public doesn't understand markets. Another one who was at Emigrant and was at Merrill says all these auditors are stopping us from making loans. That our banks are now full. From no regulation, we have now people being so scared that they stop us from doing business. I think the finance industry underwent what my memory tells me, because I'm old enough, happened to entertainment and sports. When money flowed in, values went away. And the other thing about the finance industry is the leadership was taken over by traders. And they had a certain mindset that they didn't have when Goldman Sachs was a nice partnership.
It does seem that the trading profit has become the primary motivator in the years since then. It does coincide with their going into a corporate form of business, although I don't know if it's just that or if it's the fact that capital's sloshing around so much more in the last number of years as well. I wouldn't pretend to know the cause, but it is more than the last few years, evidently. So I'm not sure if Mr. Smith has found his perfect exit, or if something came particularly late to his desk, or what. But I can corroborate the idea that there's been this actual decline in Goldman itself.
The other big thread that I saw is whether Smith did enough to change Goldman when he was there, and I'm a little skeptical about that because he was a VP, right? And so that's not high at all. That's very junior. So the question is, is whether he even had the power to make a difference. And the thing that was related to that question was, why is he so junior for so long? So maybe he had an axe to grind. So is this op-ed a result of him wanting to stick it to his employer before he left? My personal view is I tend to be more generous toward his motivations because what he's saying seems to be true, among what we're saying here. And also, in my own career, in my own experience, I think it's fairly naive to think that a young person or a junior person can necessarily change a massive organization so easily. I think that's quite extraordinary that expectations to heap on a young executive.
I come from the world of pharma, and I started my life in pharmaceuticals. And our path was we forgot who the patient is, and we went right for the sales. And we found that we were in a system where we were front-loading, we were trying to get as many sales as possible that would come from the next quarter into this quarter so that budgets would be made and incentives would be paid. But then we went through a transformation. We got a new CEO who was totally ethics-driven. And he basically turned the company on its ear. And he said, we're going to do it completely different. And we know that there's stockholder value. We know that we need to return a profit to our shareholders, but we're going to do it the right way. And I'm going to take a reprieve for about 2 years so that we can get this right. And what he did was he instituted a set of values. But it's just not a set of values on the wall. He incorporated it into everything we did, every presentation we made, how we were evaluated. He implemented the 360-degree peer performance review. And he said, those who are the #1 achievers today, I hope you're the #1 achievers tomorrow, but if you are and you've done it the wrong way, you're out the door. And it was an absolutely incredible experience to go through. And he was also very sensitive, just as the financial industry, is we were the kids to knock on the block. And big, greedy pharmaceutical companies. And we were very, proprietary, and we were very quiet in who we were because we wanted to remain under the radar screen so we wouldn't tip off any competitors. My being part of that industry for about 30 years, I thank God every day that I had the experience of seeing how to do it wrong and how to absolutely do it right. And there was never a decision that was made, whether it was to stay with the drug, if in fact we felt that, it wasn't going to be the best thing for a patient, or there could have been a problem, walk away from it, which is a very hard thing to take your R&D people and move them from one to the other.
What we're going through right now is not new. I mean, we were in the 80s with Dennis Levine and, the Young Bond King, so on and so forth. I think that we're shooting the messenger as opposed to focus on the message. We're dissecting the intentions of this gentleman who wrote something that he felt, as opposed to, well, let's say he was the worst employee. Let's assume the worst. Is the message right? Exactly. So, and does he have to be perfect, this gentleman, at his work, for us to listen to what he says? Okay, so, and he's the reason why we're here, right? I'll tell you this, 10 years from now, we'll have the same argument, the same discussion, the same conversation.
I want to say thank you all. The slightly out-of-body experience I was having as I listened to this conversation just now. And the slightly out-of-body experience I was having is feeling like this is so familiar to the kind of conversation that I used to hear when I was at Harvard Business School in the classroom there. It was similar because there were a lot of very good points that were made. It was similar because there were good points on various sides. Somebody said both sides. There's more than two sides, So there were good points on various sides that were made. It was similar in that some people had a historical perspective and some people don't. It was similar in that some people, are feeling this personal emotional frustration around trying to figure out, there has been no accountability, this is a problem, there are real victims here. Students would come out of those conversations saying the great thing about business school and being in top business schools is that you hear so many different perspectives and you see so many different points of view. Yes, that's wonderful, and that is in fact what makes us sophisticated thinkers, and it is what in fact keeps us from blindly implementing a narrow agenda on folks where it maybe doesn't fit. On the other hand, that in and of itself is not enough. You know, multiplicity, pluralism of ideas in and of itself is not enough. We have to give people a way to work through them. What I often say to people at the beginning of my remarks around the work I'm doing now is it grew out of a crisis of faith. It grew out of 10 years at Harvard Business School and then almost 20 years at other business schools around the world, and feeling that you know, maybe trying to teach business ethics to future business leaders is unethical. Because what I felt we often did is that we had these conversations, a bit like what we did here. We would bring students in, we'd give them thorny ethical case dilemmas. They would argue all the different points of view. But in the end, they would walk out experiencing what one professor said. I love the phrase. He said, "Mary, I fear that our students are experiencing ethics fatigue." And what that meant is that at a certain point, you know, they maybe came into the room thinking they knew what was right, but by the time they walked out, not only were they thinking more complexly, which is a good thing, but they were also pretty much disempowered in terms of thinking that there was something you could do. So we're teaching a different content instead of the content of ethical analysis, which is still good and still needs to be taught. But in a business school, we're trying to focus on how do you get it done, the right thing done. Faculty will often say, and actually practitioners, I've talked to many business leaders who say the same thing. They'll say, you know, Mary, the black and white issues are easy. It's the gray issues that are really hard. And I say to that, yes, gray issues are really hard. But if I could trust people to manage the black and white issues effectively, I would live with that. I would live with that. Because the gray issues are where reasonable people of goodwill and intelligence can legitimately disagree. The black and white issues are the ones where most of us, not everyone, but most of us would agree this is over the line. Why don't we focus there first? And I think this gets a little bit to some of the conversation we had just now about who Greg Smith is. And none of us really know, I don't think, at least I don't know. But typically, when we would talk about what we were trying to do in a business school classroom or what we were trying to do in a business training program, we would be thinking about that person who is maybe predisposed to break the rules, that person who's maybe predisposed to stretch the rules, and we wanted to constrain them, okay? We wanted to train them and constrain them. So what we decided is let's think about who we're teaching in an entirely different way. So we imagined a bell curve, okay? Now we can't prove this, but we imagined a bell curve, and we said at one tail end of the bell curve, let's say those are people who would self-identify as opportunists. People who would say, I will do whatever it takes to maximize my material self-interest. Values be damned. At the other end of the tail, we'll say these are the people who would self-identify as idealists. Now, nobody fits into any of these categories all the time. An idealist would say, I will always try to act on my values, regardless of the impact on my material self-interest, okay? What we say is the majority of the people in the business school classroom, I mean, they went to business school, for God's sake, and the majority of people in business, and frankly, I put myself here, are under the bell, and we call them pragmatists. And we say these, and we define pragmatism as people who would say, I would like to act on my values as long as it doesn't put me at a systematic disadvantage. Now, that's not the same as saying as long as I know I will succeed. It's not the same as saying as long as I know I won't lose. It means I think I have a shot. So if you think of people that way, then our task as educators or as managers, I feel, you know, we don't have a lot of leverage with the opportunists, frankly. I'm not so worried about the idealists, except I wish they were more skillful, more competent, okay? But I think our leverage is with the pragmatists. I think our leverage is with these folks who say, I'd like to act on my values if I thought I had a shot. And what we'll say is, well, let's give you the skills, the tools, and importantly, the practice to feel more equipped. so that you feel that you have more options, so you feel like you can be more likely to succeed. So I'm not trying to persuade anyone to be anything they're not. I'm trying to help you be who you want to be already at your best. So when I see a Greg Smith, there's a piece of me that looks at him and thinks, if you're at the point, you're already at the point of no return, which he appears to have been. My issue is, what do you have to lose to not try and address it internally before you leave? He may have, I don't know, he may have tried. But secondly, I feel that what often happens, and what GVV is about, is that what often happens when people do try and address this kind of issue internally is that it builds up, it builds up, it builds up, and it comes from a place of emotion and frustration, right? So we know that when people react in that way, they don't react very effectively. They tend to get angry, they tend to be emotional, they tend to be blaming, they tend to be less thoughtful. Often when it comes to values, people feel that if I'm righteous, if I'm on the side of virtue, if I stamp my little foot and shake my fist and speak truth to power, this is where courage is. This is what moral courage is. I mean, I'm all for moral courage, don't get me wrong, but I don't think that's our biggest need. I think our biggest need is moral competence. And I think if we become more competent at raising these issues, perhaps with lower emotion, perhaps with more skill, well, certainly with more skill, definitely with more data, definitely with more rehearsal or practice, we actually lower the need for quite so much moral courage. We need to start from the place where you actually say, you know, we think most of you have values, but you probably have different skills, and you probably have different personalities, and you probably have different profiles. So let's talk about how you could best express them. We start at these serious, high-level systemic issues, and it can disempower us. So what we start to do is we start with issues where you can have some impact. The idea is if you get skillful at that, you're going to be better able at being the individual who triggers the systemic solutions to these bigger issues that I think are hugely important. Let's start with a very short case. This gets used a lot in business schools. It's called the client who fell through the cracks. This is a person fairly young in their career working in the financial sector. She's new in the job, she's new in the firm, and she has a new boss, obviously. Her boss comes to her one day. They manage portfolios for high net worth individuals. Her boss comes to her one day and says, we have a meeting this afternoon with one of our clients. We had previously communicated to him the benchmark we were going to use for evaluating the performance of this portfolio. We have seriously underperformed the benchmark. I want you to redo the numbers and use a different benchmark so that it'll look like his performance has been better, so that we have something good to present to him this afternoon. Go, do. So she's uncomfortable with this. She kind of thinks this is wrong. So keep in mind, she's new. She doesn't really have a relationship with her boss. There's a lot of time pressure. And the question that we would do in the class is not say what's right. Some people might argue this is fine, but we don't even go there. Just say, and believe me, in a business school classroom, someone would say that's fine. But we would just say, what if you felt the way she felt? What if? This is a thought experiment. How could she maybe deal with this situation?
Susan had three options: to resign or go to the legal counsel and make a complaint as a whistleblower, but discreetly, not publicly, or follow the order and hope that she would not be complicit in securities fraud.
That's the classic sociologist research, exit, voice, or loyalty that you just lined up. That what the options people have are exit, voice, or loyalty. You have exit, you have voice, but a kind of internal whistleblowing voice. And then loyalty is the following orders. Interesting. Okay. Other thoughts? Yeah?
First of all, we didn't see that there was a problem there, right?
which is why we frame it the way we do. There's always someone like you.
We thought that there might be three solutions also. So one possibility was to just go to the boss and say, look, you know, my job is to do what you're asking me to. So you asked for this performance graph. Right. So what we did is we gave you two graphs rather than one. Well, actually three. So the first graph was the performance of the portfolio relative to the benchmark that had been stated initially. The second one is the performance of the portfolio with respect to another benchmark that we found that made it look really good, just as you asked for, along with some bullet points justifying that. And the third one is a graph that would show you the performance of the portfolio with those two benchmarks. And you could then superimpose. You could then decide how to present it to your customer. But then my able colleague actually came up with something much better, which is, you know, the second solution really is, rather than turn it into a, you know, I'm the good guy and you're the bad guy, and I'm basically showing you that you're really not a very good guy. Let's instead solve for a third problem, which is we want to keep this customer. We haven't done well. We need to clearly change what we're doing. And we don't want to get into a situation where, you know, we're doing something that's wrong, right? I mean, obviously you don't want that, and I don't want it either. So we're really on the same side of the table. And so to deal with that, let's come up with some solutions. So we're going to present the performance of the portfolio and also tell the customer how we're going to be so much better going forward.
Just the one piece I think that is critical was not to present it as a moral argument, to say that, you know, I am ethical and you're not ethical, and you know, to shift that whole conversation around facts and data and trends and risks and whatever. And because you may quit and you may walk away, but then that person is still there and those business practices are going to continue. And I think a major factor for even opportunists is if you say, look, we could have a lawsuit on our hands for whatever reason if later on it turns out that this is the case. And so one has to play to those realities and bring that out. But I think it's very important to remove the sting of kind of an ethical judgment with your colleague.
And the thought occurs to me that when a person does this, it would be entirely appropriate for him to go to another senior mentor in the firm to lay out the situation, not ask for that person's direct help, get his advice, and then he has the courage to go forward knowing that if it doesn't work, he has some built-in support if there's any adjudication that comes later. And it turns people like myself from a coward to somebody with a little greater strength.
A little more courage, yeah, that's a really interesting point. So what Susan decided to do, this is a pseudonym, of course, what Susan decided to do, she talked to someone else in the firm, some other people in the firm, said, you know, am I crazy? This isn't right, you know, and they kind of said, yeah, no, it's not right, but, you know, we don't really know what options you have. And she thought about, well, if I say no, you know, my boss is probably just going to go ask somebody else to do it, right? So the client will still be lied to. So if that bothers me, I'm not really fixing it just by saying no to the project. She didn't consider quitting. That wasn't on the table for her. So what she decided to do is she went to her boss and she said, you know, so remember the things that were going on here. Newness, short time frame, right? She went to the boss and she decided to take, those are usually the excuses the students will give for why you can't be ethical. You know, there wasn't enough time. I'm too new. I don't have any, you know, institutional capital, social capital in the organization. So she took all that and she flipped it. It's again the jujitsu move, and used it to her advantage. So she went to her boss and she said, look, you know, there really isn't time to redo this analysis in a persuasive way, as you've asked me to do. But what I can do, and this gets to what you guys said, is here I have an analysis of what happened. I have an analysis of why. I have an analysis of how we will fix this going forward, and projections of what the client can expect. And you know, I have talking points for you. So she laid the whole thing out in a very sort of persuasive way. And she wasn't sure what her boss would do because she didn't really know this guy. And what happened is the boss said, well, the boss agreed to it, and they went forward. The client accepted it. But what she said to me about the scenario, about what happened, is she said, you know what I realized is my boss, if I'd gone to my boss and told him he was wrong or that this was unethical, I know him well enough. I don't know him well, but I know him well enough to know that this was not going to fly with him, and it was certainly going to probably irrevocably damage my relationship with him. She said, but I also had the feeling that he wasn't invested in being unethical. He was invested in getting through the day. And so she said, I realized I was solving the wrong problem. I was solving the problem of how to get this unethical guy to be ethical. The problem I needed to solve was how to help my boss get through a difficult conversation with a client, which I think is closest to what you guys were talking about. And it worked. What you guys just did right now is that you all strategized about what you might do. The usual classroom conversation about this would be about how hard this is and what all the barriers are, and maybe there's a way to get around it, but students would not be practicing arguments, and they would not be thinking about, is there a way to reframe the debate? So basically, that is all that GVV is. I always tell people it's not rocket science, except when I talk to engineers, they laugh at me when I say that, but we are rocket scientists. But it is not rocket science. It's frankly just asking a different question. Instead of asking what's right, we ask, how do you get the right thing done? That's what I would like to ask Greg Smith. I wanted to end with a quote that I happened to come across the other day, and I thought it was appropriate. It's from Abraham Lincoln, of all people, but he's talking about commitment. And the first part is just usual inspirational quote stuff. You know, he says, commitment is the stuff of character, the stuff character's made of. It's the power to change the face of things. But then this is the part I liked. He said, it is the daily triumph, daily, day by day, nothing, the daily triumph of integrity over skepticism. And that's the part I liked. It's not integrity over greed. It's not integrity over falsehood. It's not integrity over self-interest. It's integrity over skepticism. And I frankly think that is what we all are facing, and certainly in the financial markets. And so that's what GVV is about. So I really loved hearing from all of you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you so much.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.